Is this the end of an era? The short answer is yes. Detroit Diesel, once America's greatest engine company, has fallen. For decades, its roar powered trucks, buses, ships, and even tanks. It was more than an engine, it was America's heartbeat. But today, that name barely sparks recognition outside of old-school truckers and engine fans. So what happened? How did Detroit Diesel go from ruling the highways with the iconic Screamin Jimmy to becoming a shadow of its former self? And could this American legend ever rise again? Or is its story already over? Stick around, because the twists behind Detroit Diesel's rise and fall will surprise you. The story of Detroit Diesel begins long before it became a household name for truckers and mechanics. It starts in 1938, in the industrial heartbeat of America, under the watchful eye of General Motors. At the time, the world was teetering on the edge of war, and the demand for stronger, more reliable engines was about to skyrocket. GM knew it had to step up. That's when they founded the GM Diesel division in Detroit, Michigan, planting the seed for what would soon become one of the most important engine companies in American history. From the very beginning, Detroit Diesel wasn't just building engines, it was building a reputation. The early focus was on lightweight, efficient two-stroke diesels that could fit into military equipment, trucks, and industrial applications. And as fate would have it, timing couldn't have been better. When World War II broke out, Detroit diesel engines became a critical part of America's war machine. They weren't just turning wrenches, they were turning the tide of history. The U.S. military relied on them for everything from tanks to landing craft. In fact, the legendary GM 71 series, introduced during this period, powered thousands of vehicles in the war effort. These weren't quiet engines. They had a raw mechanical scream that would later earn them the nickname Screamin Jimmys. Soldiers, sailors, and mechanics alike came to trust that sound because it meant their equipment would keep running even under the harshest conditions. At a time when reliability could mean the difference between victory and defeat, Detroit Diesel delivered. And when the war ended, Detroit Diesel didn't fade into the background. Instead, it shifted gears and became the backbone of America's post-war boom. The same engines that had carried soldiers into battle now carried freight across the highways. Buses, construction equipment, boats, generators, you name it, Detroit Diesel was there. For truckers, those two-stroke Detroits became more than just machines. They were lifelines, companions on long stretches of lonely interstate, engines that sang their way through the night. The company's Detroit roots also gave it an identity. This wasn't some overseas brand trying to muscle in. This was an American-built, American-powered engine, and people took pride in that. Every mechanic who learned to tune a Detroit Diesel, every driver who shifted gears with that scream behind them knew they were part of something bigger. It wasn't just horsepower, it was heritage. But here's the twist. While Detroit Diesel was thriving and becoming synonymous with toughness and durability, cracks were already forming in the foundation. The two-stroke design that made the engines so light and powerful also had limits. They guzzled fuel, they smoked, and they would eventually struggle to meet the rising environmental standards of the decades to come. But in the 1940s and 50s, nobody cared about emissions or efficiency. All that mattered was that Detroit Diesels started up every time, hauled enormous loads, and kept America moving. By the end of the 1950s, Detroit Diesel had cemented its place as the engine company of choice. It wasn't just building products, it was shaping an industry. From battlefields to bus depots, from highways to harbors, the brand was everywhere. And yet, for all its dominance, the seeds of its eventual downfall were quietly being sown. The same two-stroke magic that made it famous would later make it vulnerable. So the question becomes, how did this engine maker go from unstoppable dominance to the beginning of its struggles? To understand that, we need to step into its golden age, the roaring decades, when Detroit Diesel ruled the road and its engines became legends of American culture. If the birth of Detroit Diesel laid the foundation, then the golden era of the company came when its two-stroke engines roared to life and became legends on the highways. This was the period when Detroit Diesel wasn't just another name in the industry, it was the name. From the late 1940s through the 1970s. The company's engines weren't only everywhere, they were unforgettable. They powered a generation of truckers, builders, and bus drivers who would swear by their reliability and the unmistakable sound that came with them. The engines that defined this era were the Series 71 and later the Series 92. These weren't just machines, they were cultural icons. The Series 71, introduced in the 1930s, but exploding in popularity after the war, was light, powerful, and versatile. It could be found in everything from buses to bulldozers to boats. And when truckers hit the road, the distinct scream of those engines filled the night air. That sound wasn't just noise. It was music to the ears of drivers who trusted their lives and livelihoods to Detroit power. The nickname Screamin Jimmy stuck because it fit perfectly. Anyone who ever stood next to a two-stroke Detroit at full throttle knows that sound burrows into your memory and never leaves. But beyond the sound, the engines had personality. They were simple enough that a good mechanic with a set of tools could tear one down on the side of the road and get it running again. They had quirks, sure, like their tendency to leave a smoky haze trailing behind them, but for drivers, that wasn't a flaw, it was a badge of honor. When you saw the cloud and heard the scream, you knew work was getting done. And in those decades, that was all that mattered. Detroit diesels became especially popular with long-haul truckers. At a time when America was rapidly building its interstate system, these engines were the beating heart of the freight industry. The Series 71 could handle the miles, the abuse, and the punishing schedules better than most. Truckers developed an emotional bond with their Detroits because they weren't just machines under the hood, they were loyal companions. When a driver climbed into the cab for another grueling coast-to-coast run, the engine's roar was reassurance. It was the sound of money being made, freight being delivered, and the journey being survived. And it wasn't just truckers. City transit systems relied on Detroit diesels to move millions of passengers every day. Construction sites ran them in loaders, cranes, and dozers. The engines were even at home in the water, propelling boats and ferries with the same ferocity they brought to highways. Detroit diesel wasn't confined to one industry. It was everywhere, an industrial backbone that kept America moving and building. By the 1960s and 70s, Detroit diesel engines had become an inseparable part of American culture. They showed up in pop culture references, in the stories truckers told at diners, and even in the nostalgia that mechanics still hold on to today. If you talk to an old-school driver or fleet manager, chances are they'll tell you about a Detroit they drove or fixed that simply refused to quit. These engines built reputations not on fancy marketing, but on decades of relentless performance. But even as Detroit diesel basked in its golden age, challenges were quietly approaching. Competitors like Cummins and Caterpillar were investing heavily in new four-stroke technology, engines that promised more torque, better fuel efficiency, and fewer emissions. Regulators were starting to pay attention to the black smoke that poured from exhaust stacks. And while truckers loved their Screamin Jimmys, the writing on the wall suggested that this era of raw, unfiltered diesel power couldn't last forever. For the moment, though, Detroit diesel stood tall. It had earned the loyalty of a generation, and its two-stroke scream was the sound of progress, prosperity, and the open road. The question wasn't whether Detroit diesel was great. It was whether that greatness could survive the changing tides of technology and regulation. And that's where the story takes a turn, because the same engines that defined Detroit diesel's golden years would soon become its biggest liability, forcing the company to adapt or risk losing everything it had built. By the 1960s, Detroit diesel wasn't just another GM division, it was the engine company. The post-war boom had transformed America, and at the heart of highways, construction sites, and harbors were Detroit's screaming two-strokes. If you needed power that was tough, loud, and reliable, chances are it had Detroit stamped on the side. The secret weapon was versatility. Very few engines in history have worn so many different uniforms and done it convincingly. The Series 71 was the star, built in multiple cylinder configurations, from inline fours to monstrous V16s. In trucks, they hauled freight across endless highways, with the sound of a Detroit ringing in a driver's ears for days. In buses, they carried millions of Americans to school and work, becoming part of everyday life without people even realizing it. On construction sites, they powered cranes, bulldozers, and earth movers that were literally reshaping the American landscape. And on the water, they roared inside ferries, tugboats, and even Coast Guard vessels, their scream bouncing across harbors. That adaptability wasn't limited to America. Detroit Diesel was a passport brand. Military exports, like amphibious vehicles, tanks, and generators, spread its reputation across Europe and Asia. Developing countries, hungry for engines that could survive harsh conditions and bad fuel, leaned on Detroit to power factories, buses, and ships. In places where reliability meant survival, a Detroit diesel was the safest bet you could make. The name Detroit Diesel became shorthand for what a diesel engine should be: rugged, simple, and dependable. But beyond practicality, Detroit was building a cultural identity. For truckers, especially long-haul drivers, a Detroit wasn't just an engine, it was a badge of honor. Pulling into a truck stop with a screaming two-stroke meant everyone heard you before they saw you. The sound turned heads. The trail of smoke left behind was like a calling card. It wasn't subtle. It was pure attitude. Trucking magazines, radio chatter, and diner stories were full of tales about Screamin Jimmys flying down interstates, outreaving their Cummins rivals and shaking the ground with that unmistakable mechanical howl. To drive with a Detroit was to drive with pride. Mechanics shared in that loyalty. These weren't finicky, over-engineered motors that demanded lab coats and delicate procedures. They were straightforward. A wrench, some grit, and the right know-how could keep a Detroit alive for decades. Rebuilding one wasn't a nightmare. It was a rite of passage. For fleets, this meant downtime was minimal and repair costs stayed low. For independent mechanics, it meant a steady stream of work they could actually tackle. Detroit's simplicity made it not only the workhorse of America, but also the teacher of America's diesel mechanics. If you could fix a Detroit, you could fix anything. By the 1970s, Detroit diesel wasn't just dominant, it was everywhere. GM had turned the brand into a national symbol of reliability. Its engines were in school buses, Greyhound coaches, semi-trucks, mining rigs, ships, and the military. When people thought diesel, they thought Detroit. The scream wasn't just a sound, it was the heartbeat of American industry. From cities to fields to ports, the voice of Detroit echoed day and night. But dominance has a way of blinding giants. Detroit felt untouchable, and that confidence hardened into complacency. Cummins was quietly refining its four-stroke technology, prioritizing fuel economy and long-haul durability. Caterpillar was carving into the heavy-duty markets with engines that matched Detroit in toughness but offered better efficiency. International, Harvester, and Mack were sharpening their designs too. The competition was relentless, and Detroit's two-stroke formula, though beloved, wasn't evolving fast enough. Meanwhile, Washington was changing the rules of the game. The Clean Air Act was beginning to tighten emission standards, and suddenly Detroit's trademark scream didn't sound quite so future-proof. The very two-stroke design that had built an empire was now under scrutiny. Fuel prices were climbing, regulations were tightening, and Detroit's biggest strength, its screaming simplicity, was about to become its biggest liability. The 1960s and 70s had cemented Detroit diesel as the king of American diesel power, but cracks were forming in the empire, and once those cracks widened, the fall would come faster than anyone expected. At its peak, Detroit diesel felt untouchable. Its engines powered trucks, buses, boats, and heavy equipment across America, but in the 1970s and 80s, cracks began to show. The biggest issue? Emissions. For decades, nobody questioned the black smoke pouring from a Detroit's exhaust. Truckers even saw it as a badge of toughness. Regulators, however, saw pollution, and new laws forced engine makers to clean up their act. Suddenly, Detroit's two-stroke design, once its greatest strength, became a weakness. Two strokes delivered power and compactness, but they were thirsty and dirty compared to four-stroke rivals. Cummins and Caterpillar doubled down on four-stroke technology, producing cleaner, more efficient engines that appealed to cost-conscious fleets. Reliability also played a role. While Detroit's were easy to service, they didn't always outlast a Cummins, which built a reputation for million-mile endurance in an industry where every dollar per mile mattered. Loyalty to the Detroit Scream was giving way to hard economics. The global oil crises of the 1970s made matters worse. Rising fuel prices punished inefficient engines, and Detroit's two-stroke drank fuel at a painful rate. Meanwhile, a cultural shift in trucking was underway. Old-school drivers still loved the sound of a Detroit, but younger truckers wanted smoother, quieter, and more efficient engines. What once felt iconic now felt outdated. Inside Detroit Diesel, parent company GM wasn't helping. Investment lagged, and Detroit was treated like just another division rather than a crown jewel. By the early 1980s, the cracks had widened. The once dominant brand was slipping fast. To survive, Detroit needed more than tweaks. It needed a miracle. That miracle would come in the form of a game-changing engine that redefined the company, the legendary Series 60. By the late 1980s, Detroit Diesel was running out of time. Emissions laws were tightening, fuel efficiency mattered more than ever, and their beloved two-stroke engines were looking like dinosaurs. Rivals like Cummins and Caterpillar were winning the battle, and Detroit needed a miracle. That miracle came in 1987 with the Series 60. It wasn't just a new engine, it was a complete reinvention. For the first time, Detroit went four-stroke, abandoning the identity that had defined them for half a century. Risky? Absolutely, but it was the smartest move they ever made. The Series 60 introduced electronic controls at a time when most engines were still mechanical. This meant real-time monitoring, precise fuel delivery, and unmatched emissions performance. Suddenly, Detroit Diesel wasn't just surviving regulations, it was leading the charge. Add in incredible fuel efficiency and the ability to run 1 million miles with good maintenance, and fleets across America fell in love. By the mid-1990s, the Series 60 was everywhere. It powered Freightliners, Kenworths, Peterbilts, you name it. It became one of the best-seller diesel engines of all time, cementing Detroit's comeback story. But the world doesn't stop turning. Even as the Series 60 conquered the roads, new storms were brewing. Global consolidation was reshaping the industry, and Detroit Diesel was about to change hands in a way that would alter its destiny forever. In 2000, Daimler-Benz swooped in and bought Detroit Diesel. At first, it seemed like a perfect marriage. Daimler owned Freightliner, North America's biggest truck maker. Pairing Freightliner trucks with Detroit engines was a no-brainer. The Series 60 kept selling, and Daimler poured resources into the brand. But with global ownership came new priorities. Daimler wasn't sentimental about Detroit's heritage. It was focused on efficiency and worldwide strategy. That meant Detroit Diesel had to fall in line. The independence and grit that had once defined the company slowly faded. By 2007, Detroit Diesel wasn't just Detroit anymore. Daimler rebranded it as Detroit, dropping diesel from the name. The lineup expanded to include axles, transmissions, and integrated systems. On paper, it was progress. On the road, it felt like the identity that once made Detroit special was being erased. Truckers noticed. The old-school culture of Detroit, the underdog spirit, the engine-first mentality, it was all being absorbed into Daimler's corporate machine. The Series 60 was retired in favor of new global platforms. Yes, the technology advanced, but something deeper was lost. Detroit Diesel was no longer America's renegade engine builder. It was a cog in a global operation. If the 2000s were about global expansion, the 2010 were about survival under crushing emissions rules. The US government and EPA kept raising the bar, forcing companies to add exhaust after treatment, EGR systems, and SCR technology. Meeting these standards was brutal and expensive. Detroit's new engines, like the DD13, DD15, and DD16, were built for this era. They featured advanced fuel injection, turbocharging, and emissions systems that could keep regulators happy. Technically, they were marvels, but to drivers and fleet owners, they sometimes felt overcomplicated. Maintenance costs soared, downtime increased, and the simplicity of the old days was gone for good. Truckers who grew up with the scream of a 671 now found themselves behind the wheel of engines that felt sterile, corporate, and burdened by sensors. Yes, they were cleaner. Yes, they were efficient. But the raw personality that made Detroit diesel legendary was fading into memory. Still, Detroit adapted. It became less about being the loudest voice in trucking and more about being part of Daimler's fully integrated ecosystem. Engines, transmissions, and axles all worked together, connected by telematics and software. It was progress, no doubt, but progress that cost Detroit its soul. By the 2020, the writing was on the wall. The diesel engine itself was under siege. Electric trucks, hydrogen fuel cells, and hybrid drivetrains were dominating headlines. California and other states began drafting timelines to phase out diesel entirely. Suddenly, it wasn't about whether Detroit diesel could compete with Cummins or Caterpillar, it was whether diesel had a future at all. Detroit kept releasing new versions of its DD engines, but the buzz was gone. Younger truckers didn't grow up with the Detroit scream. They didn't have that nostalgia. And fleets were increasingly being pressured to look at zero-emission alternatives. The name Detroit diesel still carried weight, but it no longer represented the scrappy, iconic company it once was. What had started in World War II as America's go-to engine builder had become a subsidiary, a brand folded into Daimler's global truck empire. For fans, it felt like watching a legend fade, not because the engines were bad, but because the identity was gone. The fall of Detroit diesel wasn't one catastrophic collapse. It was a slow fade, chipped away by global ownership, emissions rules, and the march toward electrification. By the time most people realized what had happened, America's greatest engine company was already gone in everything but name. So, was Detroit diesel's fall a tragedy? Or just the natural end of an era? Maybe both. For decades, Detroit built engines that defined American trucking, from the screaming two-strokes that powered victory in World War II and freedom on the highways, to the revolutionary Series 60 that saved fleets millions in fuel. Detroit diesel's fingerprints are all over American industry. But times change. The same qualities that once made Detroit legendary, raw sound, brute strength, rebellious identity, don't fit in a world chasing zero emissions and quiet, software-driven efficiency. Detroit didn't die overnight. It evolved, transformed, and eventually lost the very spirit that made it special. And yet, the legacy lives on. At truck shows across the country, fans still gather around polished 671S and Series 60S, swapping stories about the good old days. Collectors pay big money for engines that once powered workhorses across America. The Detroit name may now belong to a global corporation, but the myth, the nostalgia, the pride, that belongs to the people who loved it. So the real question is this the end of Detroit diesel's story, or just the beginning of a new one? Because as long as someone fires up a two-stroke and lets that scream echo down a back road, Detroit diesel will never truly die. And if you've made it this far, you probably feel the same way. If you loved this deep dive into America's greatest engine company, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this, and drop your favorite Detroit diesel memory in the comments. We'll see you in the next one.